folks, welcome back to My Kitten Reads. I'm Eleanor and this is my October reading wrap up. Do excuse me if I cough a bit in this. Hay fever's been so bad the last couple of days. So who knows how my throat's going to hold up to talking. So October, I did actually read 10 books, which is always the goal. Most of them were Austen variations. So, you know, I'm reading a lot of those at the moment. I'm getting good use out of my Kindle Unlimited. But there are some other ones because, of course, Dewey's Readathon finished off the month. So that's great. So what did I read? Well, the first thing I actually finished in October was an audiobook, and it was How to Behave Badly in Renaissance Britain by Ruth Goodman, which was essentially a whole collection of research about insults and fighting and rudeness and how to behave badly in sort of from sort of the Tudor period up until sort of the late 17th century, which was interesting. But I don't know if it was the way it was structured, but I kept drifting out. Like I was listening to it and I would just suddenly realize I hadn't heard the last 5 minutes because I just drifted. So perhaps not the best book for me, but it was still pretty interesting in parts, so that was good. Then I read Elizabeth is Not a Bennet by Lara Bekendik. So in this one, Elizabeth, not a Bennet, but as the daughter of one of Mr. Bennet's university friends whose mother passed away, and then her father remarried to her aunt, only to discover that her aunt was greedy and self-serving, and when he knew he was going to probably not survive, knew that her aunt would not treat her well, particularly as his son by her was meant to inherit, and so he sent Lizzie to Mr. Bennet to be raised. And this story is essentially the Bennets discovering actually there's more to her inheritance than they ever thought. Yeah, interesting. Then I read A Change of Family by Charlotte Grandison, which is Charlotte Grandison's most recent one. And in this one, Jane has a tendency towards infections in her chest. And so therefore, when she gets ill at Netherfield, she actually passes away. And so it's very much dealing with Lizzie's grief, her anger at her parents for letting Jane go out on Nellie in the rain, and how she sort of recovers from that, as well as being the usual Mr. Darcy romance. But in this case, she thinks better of him because he was very kind and helpful when she was trying to take care of Jane. Then I read The Bennet Inheritance by Jan Rowland. So in this one, we're in a situation where Mr. Bennet's grandfather passed away after when his father was away in Europe, and had been convinced by the Collinses and the lawyers, the Phillips, to sign away his Longbourn to Mr. Collins the elder, so the regular Mr. Collins' father, or in this case, distant relation. And our book starts because, as it turns out, that Mr. Collins has gotten very elderly and passed away and actually left Longbourn back to the Bennet line. And the Mr. Bennet that we know, Lizzie's dad, has been a clergyman, and so they are arriving at Longbourn to reclaim their family estate and try and figure out how to be gentry. And they happen to know the Darcys because it was old Mr. Darcy who helped Lizzie's grandfather pull himself together and find a living and become a clergyman. So, so the families are already connected. Then Mr. Bennet's Death by Elaine Burkett. And in this one, Mr. Bennet passes away. Mr. Darcy discovers when he's in Kent from Charlotte Lucas, gets really worried about Elizabeth, has to convince Charlotte Lucas that he actually is concerned for Elizabeth before she will tell him anything. And Lizzie approaches her future relationship with a lot more practicality because she is in the situation where she's living with the Gardners because the Gardners took in her and Jane, but there's not a lot of room at the Gardners, and her mother and the younger girls are still in Meryton with the Phillips, and she's essentially confronted with the fact that this is not a life of dependency on her relations, is not going to be a happy life. It's not going to be a useful life. And so when Mr. Darcy reappears in her life, she approaches the whole situation with a hell of a lot more practicality. Although not without the same Lizzie emotion that we're used to. So then, of course, it was these books, so that are over here. Mislaid in Parts Half Known by Shauna Maguire, which was the only book with queer characters that I read. And so this is from the Eleanor West Home for Wayward Children series, novella. And in this one of our more recent characters, the one who she can find anything, which means she can find people's doors, but she doesn't want to be forced to find doors that shouldn't be found. And so she ends up escaping one of the other students with the usual cast of characters, including Kate, through a door and have to sort of find their way back to where they belong. And in this case, she's going to go back to her world, the store, and because the things she was promised in one of the previous books that they would start telling people who came through the store the cost of opening doors, but they are not doing so, and so she's going to set things right and take her place now that she understands everything better, but she's also going to get everyone else home. So that's great. Then I finished Closed Casket by Sophie Hannah. This is one of the new Poirot mysteries. Didn't see what was happening coming. It was a Poirot mystery. It was set in a country house. There was nobility. There was someone who died that didn't make sense. 2 different forms of death. Witness statements couldn't line up properly. So, of course, there was a timing issue. There's always a timing issue. So that was Closed Casket. And then I also finished the anthology The Art of Being Human, edited by Tahani Croft with Stephanie Light. So this was during the COVID pandemic, one of Fablecroft's publications. I'm not sure, I think this was like a one-off because Fablecroft is sort of defunct as a small press at the moment, but with the arts being one of the first things on the chopping block during COVID, these are a bunch of stories, mostly sort of speculative fiction stories about the importance of art to humanity, what happens when we have art, what happens when we don't have art, the different places we can find art. So yeah, there was a lot of interesting stories, some positive, some quite depressing, but yeah, definitely a worthwhile read. And then to finish off the month, I had a couple more Austen Variations. Heir Apparent by Clarissa Joy Thomas. So in this one, Jane is actually James. I think this is the one. Where Jane is actually James, and so that of course changes the Bennets' interactions with everyone because there is a son to take over Longbourn. And Mr. Collins gets murderous. And then When Love Is True by Melissa Ann, which is escaping me. Which one? When Love Is True, which one was this? I think this one is the one that I read that Lizzie was expelled from Longbourn after an accident with a horse got Jane hurt, and Jane refused to take any blame, and Mrs. Bennet got up in arms, and so Lizzie goes. I think this is one where Lizzie goes to live with the Gardners, meets Mr. Darcy that way, and then is suddenly summoned home, and therefore hurries up her wedding because, as it turns out, she's been summoned home to marry Mr. Collins. So I think that's the one. I've read a lot of Austen Variations lately. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so those were the 10 books that I read in October. I'm doing all right so far in November. I'm making good progress through at least one audiobook. I have actually picked up an old Alcray book from a couple of years ago. I've only read a couple of chapters of that so far. I'm also making progress on my reread of Pride and Prejudice. So, and there's been some Austen variations, because of course I have. Like I said, too many. Oh my God. Yeah, so fingers crossed I can get some more variation into my reading this month, particularly now that I am finished the final subject of my degree, so long as I pass. So I have time and nothing else to focus on except for my cross stitch and hockey and the end of the Formula 1 season. But yes, so that is the plan, is to try and read a little bit more widely this month. So we will see how I go, and hopefully I don't end up having to read like 5 books in 5 days at the end of the month again. That would be bad. All right, bye.